the ancient faith for the ancient faith for the modern world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and true, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live. We're starting over 15 minutes late this evening. We've been having some technical difficulties. I wasn't able to connect to the studio, and right now I'm hearing myself echo in my own headset. So, Bobby, if you're listening, it's very difficult to talk while I'm listening to my words come back to me a couple of seconds later. That's why I flubbed up the prayer. So we're not quite up to speed yet. And if you could adjust whatever is necessary at the studio, Bobby, I would appreciate that to eliminate the echo. But I'll try to soldier on while he works on that. Today's date is April 8th, 2024, and this is the 67th lesson on the Gospel of St. Matthew. And we are going to continue to discuss a very key passage in the Gospel of Matthew, and that is the statement of Christ to St. Peter after Peter's confession of faith. So, here is what happened. When the Lord and the disciples were together at the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And some said John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah, etc. And then he said, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, Petros, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So, last week we began discussing this very important passage, and I told you about how in the early church this was never taken, as it is interpreted today in the Catholic Church, as giving Peter primacy over the entire church. St. John Chrysostom said that the rock that upon which the Lord would build his church is the statement, the confession of Peter. The rock is the statement that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. This is supported not only by the use of the word rock in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. And it was very clear in the early church that St. Peter was not the rock upon which the church was founded. That is today official Catholic teaching. It's in the Catholic Catechism, which I read last week, that the church is founded on St. Peter. That's literally what is said by most Catholics today. But in Greek, it is obvious that the church is not the that Peter is not the foundation of the church. And here's why. Because Jesus says, "Si Petros, you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church." Petros is masculine. That became the name or the nickname of St. Peter. Well, Simon, who becomes Peter. But then the second word, Petra, is feminine. It's a different word. It is the word that is used in the Septuagint and also elsewhere in the New Testament in reference to Jesus Christ. So we see this in the Gospel of Matthew itself, in Matthew 7, chapter 7, verses 24 to 25, where the Lord says, "Everyone who listens to my words and follows them builds his house upon the rock." And the word there is Petra. And of course, he's not talking about St. Peter. "And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and on that house, but it didn't fall because it had that foundation. It was founded on the rock." And the word there is Petra. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, St. Paul also refers to Christ as the rock. And the word there is Petra. And of course, the best example comes from the words of St. Peter himself in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8, when he says that those who believe consider Christ is a precious stone, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. And that's, of course, a prophecy. But the word there, of course, is stone, lithos. And then he continues and says, "A stone that will make men stumble, a rock that will make them fall," or sometimes it's translated, "a rock of offense." And the word there is Petra. So this is how the early church understood Petra. They did not believe that the church was founded on St. Peter, or that this particular blessing that the Lord gave to Peter was something that set him apart from the other disciples, in the sense that he was given primacy or supremacy or some kind of extra authority over all the other disciples or over the entire church. Now, to this point, when I have mentioned this to Catholics, they usually object and they will say that, but Peter would have been speaking with Jesus in Aramaic. But the same thing holds true in Aramaic. There is a different word, as we know, because Paul always refers to Simon Peter as Cephas or Kephas in Greek. That's the Aramaic word for rock, but that's not the same word that is used to refer to God as the rock in the Old Testament, you see. So when the Old Testament refers to God as the fortress or my rock and my salvation, in Greek, in the Septuagint, it is the word Petra. So it's clear here that the reference is to Jesus Christ. Now, in Hebrew or Aramaic, the word is not Cephas, it's not Kephas, it's Selah or Tsur. So anyhow, we talked about the official statement of the Catholic Church in the Catholic Catechism, but in the early church, as we see the behavior of the apostles in the book of Acts, when there was a controversy, there's no question that Peter was the chief apostle, the leader of the apostles. The Orthodox Church has never denied that. It's even in our hymnography. But that he was never given authority over everyone else, never recognized with this kind of papal supremacy that the Catholic Church proposes today. So St. John Chrysostom said that the rock on which the church was built is the faith about Jesus Christ. That is, his identity as the Messiah and Son of God. That's the foundation of the church. And St. St. Augustine said the same thing, that the church is not built on Peter, but on Christ. And I read those passages last week. So the reason why this is important is that in the New Testament, the references to Petra are references to Christ. Peter says that, Paul says that, Christ himself refers to himself and his words as the Petra. And then, of course, early fathers of the church, like St. John Chrysostom and even St. Augustine, who is a Latin father, said that the church is founded on Christ, on the fact of Christ being the Messiah and the Son of God, not on the person of Peter. That's quite impossible to imagine that the church of God would be founded on a person. So this is the earliest tradition of the church. And that's why the Orthodox hold to this interpretation. And it doesn't matter how many scriptures the Catholics throw at us to insist that Peter had this kind of supremacy or authority over the entire church that was given by God, because if the early church did not recognize that, if the early church did not function in that way, if the early church did not believe it or teach it themselves, then we don't care how many scriptures you produce with your interpretation. The fact is that the early church did not understand those scriptures as referring to that kind of authority. That's not how the early church functioned, and that's not how they understood those scriptures. So this is a fundamental difference between the Eastern Church and the Catholic Church, but the Eastern Church is not pointing to or reinterpreting these scriptures in a way that suits itself. Instead, the Eastern Church is remaining faithful to the apostolic tradition, to the apostolic understanding of what Petra is. You are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church. He doesn't say you are Petros, and on this Petros, I will build my church, or on you, Peter, I will build my church. He's using it as a pun. It's a play in words. Peter expressed the faith of the church. And for this reason, this is why the church is built on the statement, that is, not because Peter said it, but on the truth of that statement. So let's go on with this passage, because he says, on this I will build my church, on this Petra, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Well, let's talk about Hades. First of all, Hades is not hell. Unfortunately, too many people confuse the two because they're used synonymously in English. But Hades is simply the place of the dead. And so what the Lord is saying is that death will not prevail against the church. The gates of Hades. So in the era of the early church, of course, in Greek mythology, there's an understanding that all the dead people went to Hades. That's Greek teaching. Hades is not hell. Everybody who died went to the underworld. That's Hades. The Jews had a similar idea, and that they called Sheol, the place of the dead. When somebody died, they went there. They didn't really understand what it was. They couldn't exactly explain it, but it was the place of the dead. But there is a difference between Hades and hell. Hell is the place of eternal punishment. Hades is the place where all the dead go. And this is the place that Christ conquered by the resurrection. So when we look at the icon of the resurrection, some people call it the harrowing of hell. That is Christ conquering hell. But really it should be the harrowing of Hades, because there's still a hell, a place of eternal punishment, but not all the dead people are going to be in hell. And not all of the dead in Hades are going to be liberated from hell or going to avoid hell, you see. So, the blessing that was conferred upon Peter, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. This is something also that we need to explore and explain. When he speaks upon, as the Lord continues, this blessing to bind and loose is something that was given to all of the disciples. So what we're going to do right now is pause momentarily, and then when we return, we will continue with our discussion about what is meant by the keys And why did the bishops of Rome change the symbol of St. Peter to the keys? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Registration is open for the 6th Annual Ancient Faith Women's Retreat, November 7th through 10th, 2024, at the beautiful Antiochian village in Bolivar, Pennsylvania. We will learn and reflect together on the refuge, discipline, calling, and function of prayer with Mother Christophora, abbess of the Monastery of the Transfiguration in Pennsylvania, Dr. Rositza Schroeder of St. Vladimir Seminary, Dr. Mary Ford and Dr. David Ford of St. Tikhon Seminary, and Father Alexander Gusettis, host of the Family Matters podcast. Register now at store.ancientfaith.com/events. At Ancient Faith Ministries, we present our content with the understanding that viewpoints vary and how to apply Orthodox theology to today's world. We also understand that you will eventually hear something on our platform with which you may not agree. While we strive to only present material that is in line with the teachings of the Orthodox Church, we do not necessarily endorse all of the content available on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
So, along with our technical problems today, I'm a little bit under the weather, perhaps you can tell, but I do want to, so I might be sipping on a drink here as we talk. My throat is kind of dry. I had a beautiful weekend in Glenview, Illinois, with the parish of Saints Peter and Paul. I've been traveling a lot, and I'm going to be continuing my travels. And if you want to know where I'm going to be, I encourage you to go to my website, drjeannie.com. Click on the little button under my picture that takes you to a page where you can enter your email address, and then in the next newsletter, which I hope to send out this week, you will find out where I'm going to be for the remainder of here in April, and also I'm going to be in upcoming engagements. I'm going to be in Omaha, Nebraska, and Phoenix, Arizona. But to know where I'm going to be, you need to sign up for my newsletter, because I don't put that out on a public forum anymore. So we were talking about the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So the keys are not originally a symbol of St. Peter. What was the symbol of St. Peter in the early church? It's the upside down cross, the manner of his execution. So you see, for all of the saints, when they are martyred, usually there's some symbol that's associated with them, and it's usually the symbol of their martyrdom. So for example, the symbol of St. Paul is the sword, because he was beheaded by a sword. The symbol of St. Peter in the early church was the upside down cross. And how did the keys become the symbol of St. Peter? And of course, if you go to the Vatican website or you go to the Vatican, you see these crossed keys there, because keys symbolize authority. And this is how we get the idea of Peter. There's a lot of jokes about Peter at the gates of heaven. He's the one who lets you in or keeps you out or something like this. So, of course, popes use this idea of Petrine authority to buttress their claims of papal supremacy. And the Church of Rome early on was very proud of the fact that it had these two great saints who were martyred in Rome, Peter and Paul. And the early church in Rome lauded and promoted and praised both of them. And you see in early catacomb art and other artistic depictions, both Peter and Paul. But eventually Paul was dropped in favor of Peter alone, and his image was changed, or his symbol was changed from the upside down cross to the keys, to bolster Roman claims of primacy and especially supremacy. So Peter gets the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That means that he has authority. And it says, whatever he binds on earth is bound in heaven, and vice versa. Now, this is something which is not unique to Peter. This is a power, and actually this is kind of something that was practiced in rabbinic circles. The rabbis either loosened people from the requirements of the law, or they bound them to it. So this is actually a very kind of rabbinic statement that Christ is making. But this power to bind and loose is not exclusive to Peter. Later in chapter 18, in this very gospel, we will see that this very same power, this very same authority is given to all of the disciples. Peter receives the blessing first because he's the first one to confess and state who Jesus Christ really is, the Son of the living God. Last week, we talked about how St. John Chrysostom said that why didn't other people receive this blessing? For example, why doesn't Nathanael receive it when he says early in the Gospel of John, you are the Messiah, you are the King of Israel? Why doesn't Martha say that when Jesus comes to raise Lazarus, and she says, even now I believe you are the coming one, you're the Messiah? Because their understanding of what that really meant was not as complete as what Peter had. And Peter received it as a revelation directly from God. So he did not hear this from flesh and blood, from humans, but from God the Father. So the Father reveals the Son. This is Chrysostom's point. The Father reveals the Son to those whom he wishes to reveal him, and just as Christ reveals the Father. But this is not something that is unique to St. Peter. But as I mentioned, the Catholic Church will use these verses, on this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys, and other passages like John 21. Peter, do you love me? To assert papal supremacy, feed my lambs. Oh, he's the shepherd of the entire church. That's not how the early church understood those passages either. But they insist that this is the correct understanding of these passages because that interpretation has come from Rome. And because they believe already that Rome, all the interpretations from Rome, the teachings of Rome are correct. So it's circular logic, because Rome said it, it is correct, and it is correct because Rome said it. And Rome said it, therefore it is correct. So there's no escaping that. It's believed by Catholics that if you are in line with Rome, you have the correct teaching, and that Rome cannot make a mistake. Rome cannot err. And they are very frustrated with the Orthodox. They don't understand why we can't see how it is plain on its face. You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. Well, it's obvious to us that the Petra is not Peter, just as it's obvious to them that it is Peter. So why do they insist upon it, and why are they frustrated with the Orthodox? Because we don't care how you have developed the teaching to point to Peter. What we care about is what the early church taught, how the early church functioned. And it's clear in the early church that other bishops did not recognize Peter or the Bishop of Rome as having primacy, superiority, supremacy, authority, jurisdiction, however you want to call it, over the entire church. So the Orthodox insist that the best way to know the truth of a situation is to follow apostolic teaching, not what people have developed later over the years to bolster their own claims of authority, which is what happened with the bishops of Rome. So I don't care if you create a mountain of scriptural evidence, because it's interpreted in a certain way by the Catholic Church today, does not mean that that's how it was interpreted in the early church. And we know exactly how this was interpreted in the early church. I read those passages from you last time. The early church did not believe that Peter had supremacy or jurisdiction over the entire church. And then we see this, of course, in the way that the apostles behave in the early church. And we're going to talk about that. And also, even on the Latin side of the church, St. Cyprian of Carthage, in the middle of the 3rd century, there was a dispute between him and the Bishop of Rome about how to handle certain schismatics. Cyprian thought that they should be rebaptized, and the Bishop of Rome thought that they should not be rebaptized. So so Cyprian, in order to answer the question of what to do about the schismatics, people who had come into the church from a schismatic group, Cyprian of Carthage said, we don't care, what you say, Bishop of Rome. And the Carthage and Rome are not very far away, geographically speaking. He said, we're not going to do whatever you say. We're going to have a council. So he held a council and with all the bishops from his region, and they decided to rebaptize people. Now, this later did not become the teaching of the church. So when I point this out to my Catholic students, they say, but the Bishop of Rome was right. That's not the point. Yes, later the church said there was one baptism for the remission of sins. They did not rebaptize. Okay? But it doesn't matter that the Bishop of Rome was right. The question is, for our purposes, did the church recognize the Bishop of Rome as having authority over the entire church? And the answer is no. Because Cyprian doesn't recognize that, and he's a Latin bishop, very close, geographically speaking, to Rome. When the Bishop of Rome tried to assert his authority over the Church of Asia, that is today what we call modern-day Turkey, when he tried to do that at that time, what happened? Did the bishops of Asia, in other words, this had to do with the controversy over the date of Easter. In the Church of Asia, they were celebrating Easter like we do Christmas on a specific date, not according to the particular calendar, but on a specific date. And the Bishop of Rome tried to get all the churches of Asia to follow the rest of the church and always have Easter on a Sunday. Pascha wasn't on always a Sunday in the Church of Asia. They had it on the date that Christ was crucified. The 14th day of Nisan was the day they remembered the crucifixion and the resurrection. And it didn't matter what day of the week it fell on. But for the rest of the church, they always celebrated Pascha on a Sunday. So when the Bishop of Rome tried to insist upon this and force the Church of Asia to do this, to follow the rest of the church, they rejected that. And Polycarp, who was a later martyred bishop of Smyrna, said, no, we have an apostolic tradition and we're following our own tradition. So why did the bishops of Rome attempt to assert authority over other churches, and before which they were rejected? My point is, they were rejected. Why did they try to assert their authority over these other places? Because that's what Catholics point to. They'll say, well, obviously, they had authority over these other places because they told these other churches not to do this, that, or the other thing. Well, it's the point here is that the other churches in other locales did not recognize that the Bishop of Rome had that kind of authority. That's my point. It doesn't matter who was right in the end about the discussion. The question was, who recognized the Bishop of Rome as having authority over the entire church? And in the early church, nobody did. That was something that was developed gradually over time, precisely to bolster Roman authority. This was developed by the bishops of Rome and later insisted upon it by them. And this is today simply accepted by most Catholics, that this was the teaching of the early church, when in fact it was not, clearly not the teaching of the early church. So why did the bishops of Rome do this? Is there some secret? Did they know that Jesus gave Rome this special authority? No. In fact, that is something that many bishops, especially of leading sees, did. Not just the Bishop of Rome. We see, for example, Alexandria, when there was a problem in Constantinople, the Bishop of Alexandria came and held a council outside of Constantinople on the matter of St. John Chrysostom and successfully deposed St. John Chrysostom. Why did Alexandria get involved in the affairs of Constantinople? This is something that they did. St. John Chrysostom, when he was Archbishop of Constantinople, he became involved in what was going on in Ephesus because it was the leading see, and it was recognized that certain cities had more, we could say, authority, saying, sometimes people call it a kind of authority that people paid attention to because that bishop was from an important city. That's what it was. And so the point is, we see this not only in the Bishop of Rome, so that's not proof that he had that authority. We see bishops, when they thought that there was something going on outside of their jurisdiction that they thought they could help with or correct, they took that initiative. Now I see that we have a caller, and I can't read where it's from, so I suppose it's time to welcome our caller. Hello, who are you and where are you calling from? Caller?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Sharetta, and I'm from Tennessee.
Hi, Sharetta. Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. Tell me about your comment or question.
Okay, so I was actually listening to your podcast here, and you happen to talk about Hades and not being hell.
Yes.
So I was kind of wondering if you can go more into depth with that, because if you recall from the Hercules movie, Hades was the Greek god of the underworld. So I'm kind of curious about that and how that in terms with the whole Hades and hell thing.
Okay. That's a really good question. I know that this is confusing to people. I'm not familiar with the movie, but yes, that is correct. That Hades was one of the Greek gods. He's the god of the underworld. And so the Greek understanding is very limited, and so was the Jewish. They didn't necessarily, the Jews later developed an idea of punishment and reward, but they still had this notion that when the dead died, when people died, they all went to the same place, and that was called Sheol. Now, this doesn't mean that it was a place of punishment. If you were a bad person, you were punished. The Greeks had this idea too. They describe certain punishments for evil people. Like, let's say you're very thirsty and you're standing in a river, and as soon as you lower your head to try to drink from the water goes down. Or you're very hungry and there's some low-lying fruit above your head, and as soon as you reach up to try to grab the fruit goes up out of your reach. So this kind of punishment, or Sisyphus, a fellow who rolls a massive stone up a hill and it keeps rolling back down and he's never successful. So there is punishment in Hades for the evil people. This is Greek mythology now, but there's also places of paradise in Hades in the Greek mind. The same thing for the Jews. They just recognize a general place of the dead. Now, closer to the time of Christ, there is an idea of reward and punishment, two separate places, paradise and what we would call hell. But it was not sort of clearly developed in the Jewish mind. So still they would talk about how the dead go to Sheol, the place of the dead. You can kind of understand why it wouldn't be easy to understand or have a clear definition or understanding of it, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. I just also want to know more, like regarding the paradise that the Jews had and the paradise that the Greeks had. Can you explain that to me just a little bit?
Well, the paradise of the Greeks is more like, a beautiful field, the beautiful places of life where everything is, there's abundance. The Jews had, yes, this idea that you're correct about that. Well, we sort of see hints of this in the prophets. There's a sense of when, after the Lord comes, what they call the day of the Lord, there'll be kind of a judgment. There's a kind of way of life in which nobody has to worry about food or wine. It's a beautiful, I think it would be more like what Jesus describes when he talks about the kingdom as a banquet. Because if you think about it, people used to struggle every day just to have enough food. So the idea of eternal life as a place of we could say not carnal pleasures, but a place of lack of want, a place of feasting, a place of joy, a place of celebration. This is what Jesus was indicating. And that's also in the Jewish scriptures, that the lion will lay down with the...
Jesus did talk about that when he was on the cross.
That he mentioned paradise, yes.
Yes.
Yes, he does say to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise. But what is that? Well, the Jews understood it in a very carnal sense, and so do Muslims, that there will be this eternal feasting and rejoicing. But Jesus also said that the kingdom of heaven is not about food and drink, and that in the next life people neither marry nor are given in marriage. So he's using images of joy and celebration and time. This, like a wedding is a joyful time. Nobody's mourning at a wedding. So that's why he uses that image, but not in a carnal sense. So I hope that's helpful to you.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for calling. Good night. Okay, so let's go back and pick up where we left off. The call was about Hades, but what we're talking about here is the papacy. I had gone beyond that, but that's okay. So how did the early church function in terms of Roman supremacy or Roman primacy? Yes, there was a thing such as Roman primacy, but this had to do with the importance of the city. And this is something that Catholics reject. Now, another thing that we sometimes see Catholics raise as an objection to what I'm saying is the kind of flowery language that we see used in between amongst the bishops at the time. So there are letters from, let's say, Chrysostom to the Bishop of Rome, or the Bishop of Alexandria to the Bishop of Rome, and they use this beautiful sort of elaborate flowery language who talk about the Bishop of Rome as occupying the seat of St. Peter and the first of the church, first in love, and all this sort of thing. Well, this again does not prove anything, because this kind of language was common among the bishops. They always used this very laudatory, very flattering language for each other. They just did. That's the way they used to speak in a formal letter. And on this program some time ago, I read to you from Saint Cyril of Alexandria writing a letter to Nestorius, whom he regarded as a heretic, and uses the same kind of, they're very laudatory and flowery and we could say flattering language in his address to the Bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, even though Cyril of Alexandria regarded him as a heretic. This is just the protocol that was followed at the time. So Peter was the leading apostle. The Orthodox Church has never disputed that. And he had certain he had a certain primacy in the sense that he was later associated with the city of Rome, but he did not establish the city of Rome, the Church of Rome. Neither Peter nor Paul established the church at Rome. How do we know that? Because when St. Paul is writing to the Romans, we have his epistle to the Romans, there's already a church there. That's why he's writing there. He's hoping to visit that church. He says that he doesn't want to build on another man's foundation. And certainly if Peter or another leading apostle or any apostle was already there and responsible for the Church of Rome, Paul would have addressed his letter to him, or at least mentioned him. But Paul does not do that. Now, an apostle was not a bishop. So the whole theory of papal primacy for the Catholic Church is built on this idea that Peter was the Bishop of Rome, and therefore all subsequent bishops of Rome have the same level of authority that Peter had. They sort of inherited by divine right. But Peter was never the Bishop of Rome, and I will tell you why. Because he was an apostle. An apostle was not a bishop. An apostle was somebody who was ordained by Christ who was chosen by Christ, who was set apart by Christ. And apostles constantly traveled. That's what was regarded as the sign of an apostle. And if you don't believe me, you can read the Didache, the Didache ton Apostolon. This is an ancient manuscript. It's an ancient document. It's the oldest Christian document outside of the New Testament. And in the Didache, in the Didache, it says that if somebody claims to be an apostle, but he stays more than 3 days, he's a false apostle. Apostles were always traveling. Of course, some of them did stay longer than that. But the point is that the apostles were always traveling. They were evangelists. They were missionaries. So when they established a church in a place, the apostles would lay their hands on a man. They would choose a man to be the first bishop in that place. And they would lay their hands on them and consecrate that man to become the bishop of that place. So bishops were established in a specific see, and they didn't travel all around and try to claim jurisdiction over other places. They were established and consecrated for a particular place, just like we do. So we have the Archbishop of New York. We have the Metropolitan of San Francisco, the Metropolitan of Chicago, this kind of a thing. So they are consecrated to that place. An apostle was not consecrated to serve in a particular place. An apostle was always traveling. So Peter was never the Bishop of Rome. Before he got to Rome, Peter was associated with Antioch. If he was the bishop anywhere, it would be more likely to be Antioch. What happens, of course, is that Peter happens to be martyred in Rome around the year 65 during the persecution of Nero. So he comes to be associated with Rome. And without a doubt, when Peter finally did arrive in Rome, he was certainly the most important person in the Roman Church because he was the leading apostle. But that does not make him Bishop of Rome. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the claim of the Catholic Church is that because he was Bishop of Rome, all subsequent bishops of Rome have the same authority that Peter had. But if he wasn't Bishop of Rome, then there's nothing special about somebody who is Bishop of Rome, that he gets sort of special divine prerogatives. That's what is claimed. So now, contrary to, as I said, the popular misconception, Peter did not establish the Church of Rome. So why did the Church of Rome, if Peter did not establish it, if Peter was not the Bishop of Rome, why did the Church of Rome have what was regarded in the early church as having a kind of primacy? Not supremacy, but primacy. Well, this is because Rome was the imperial capital. It was the capital of the empire. Now, again, this is something which the Roman Church, the later bishops of the Church of Rome, worked very, very hard to deny. But we know that primacy was based on the fact that Rome was the most important city in the empire. We're going to take a break at this moment, and when we return, I will explain why.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we're talking about the primacy of Rome, how that functioned in the early church. Why did the Church of Rome have a kind of primacy? And we do recognize that the Orthodox also recognize this. Why don't we recognize then the primacy of Rome today? By the way, I'll mention this in a minute. The reason why is because Rome was recognized as having primacy as long as it was teaching the Orthodox faith. But once Rome stopped teaching the Orthodox faith, and one of the false doctrines that was introduced was this idea of papal supremacy, not just primacy, but supremacy. Then, and among other things, other doctrines that were introduced, like the Filioque, like the Immaculate Conception, other things. Once Rome fell away in that sense and was teaching falsehoods, the Orthodox Church could not recognize the primacy of Rome, even as a primacy of honor. So the early church recognized that Rome had what they called primacy of honor. And this is how what this means, that when all of the bishops got together, Rome would preside over the meeting. In the church, there's always an order that is followed. Perhaps you've been to church sometime when there were a lot of priests, or maybe more than one bishop, let's say at the consecration of a church, or the feast day of a church. When you see all the priests lining up in procession, there's an order that is followed. It has to do with their ranking. Now, some people rank above others. A bishop ranks above a priest. But among the priests and also among the bishops, there are different rankings depending upon the importance of their see, or especially for the priests, for example, how long they've been a priest. So you will see the priests line up in the sanctuary, and they're lining up. For example, the priests are in order of the date of their ordination. So the first ones to come out are always the priests who are ordained and have been a priest longer, and then the last one is always the priest who has been a priest a shorter period of time. So my point about this is that the church follows an order. And so they established, there was kind of this understanding that Rome had primacy, and if they were to ever meet, it was the Bishop of Rome who would preside over a meeting because he was the bishop at the most important city of the empire. Now, of course, Catholics will deny this and say he's presiding because he's been given special prerogatives by Christ. He has authority over the entire church. But we know that this is not true. Again, from the practice of the early church and the decisions that were made by the early church. And here it is. It's called primacy of honor, and the Bishop of Rome was given the title first among equals. The equals part is very important because all bishops were regarded as equal in the early church. And still today in the Orthodox Church, somebody might have the title metropolitan, other one is just a bishop, others an archbishop, one is a patriarch, but they're all still just bishops. And that title that they have does not really give them additional authority in terms of deciding. They don't decide things by themselves. It might represent a geographical area over which they exercise authority, but they don't have any more power or authority within the church. They don't get more points. So, for example, when there's a question that arises in the Orthodox Church, the bishops will get together. They also have standing councils that meet regularly, and they make decisions. Nobody has the right to overrule anyone else. That's the case in the Catholic Church. All of the Catholic bishops of America can have a council, and they do. They meet on a regular basis. They can make a decision, but if the Roman pontiff doesn't accept it, he will overrule it. He'll ignore it. That's impossible in the Orthodox Church. We don't do that because the early church didn't function like that. All bishops were equal. So when they have a discussion about how to solve a problem, they take a vote, but the ecumenical patriarch does not have a vote. He can't overrule everybody else. I mean, sometimes I've heard this very recently. Catholics will say, well, you have a patriarch, it's the same as a pope. It is not the same as a pope. He will preside over the meeting because he is the second after Rome. And since Rome has fallen away and broken away and is schism with us, the person who presides over gatherings of the Orthodox Church is the ecumenical patriarch. He's number 2. But he doesn't have veto power, and he can't force or tell people how to vote. And so he has a power that's very different, or an authority that's very different from what we see in by the Bishop of Rome. And by the way, again, as I said to you, the bishops of Rome were pushing this envelope, trying to assert a kind of authority before they came up with this language, pointed to these passages, and were followed by people who actually believed that they had additional authority. So I mentioned Cyprian of Carthage. He did not care that the Bishop of Rome had said this is how we should handle these schismatic baptisms. He didn't care about that. He had his own council. The bishops decided something, and what they did was different from what the Bishop of Rome told them to do. And you know what St. Cyprian said? He said, no one can be a bishop of bishops. So he rejected this idea of a kind of supremacy of Rome. So that's, again, 3rd century. Now, so Rome played a very important role as the capital of the empire. And this is what gave the Roman see a kind of preeminence, a kind of primacy that was recognized because it was the most important city. But all bishops were equal, and nobody had authority over anybody else, and nobody could venture into anybody else's territory and tell them what to do. Of course, there was no single leader. So how did the early church govern itself? Each local bishop was responsible for his own area, and when there was a dispute, they would gather together in a council. So what unified Christians throughout the world was not one head, one jurisdiction. Today, the Catholic Church is unified in only one way. It is because everyone recognizes the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The Catholic Church otherwise is in complete disarray. They have lots of different theologies, lots of different spiritualities, lots of different churches, but they're united because they all recognize the Bishop of Rome as the head. That is not how the early church functioned. The early church was united in their faith. It was united by a common faith, common beliefs, and common practices. That is what unites the Orthodox Church today. We are united by common faith, by common belief, by common liturgy, by common practices, by common, by a unified unity of the faith, as we say, praying for the unity of the faith. This is what unites the Orthodox Christians, not an artificial structure that is imposed upon the church from above. Everybody has to answer to this one person. Everybody must do this one thing. So the power of the papacy is immense. And I don't think that Orthodox Christians completely appreciate how powerful it is that he, with one decision, the Bishop of Rome, can change the entire direction of the Catholic Church. I mean, this is something that's very, very foreign to us because it was never the practice of the early church. So what do we see in the early church? What set the standard for how decisions would be made when there were disagreements in the early church? Well, we have it in the Bible. It's in the book of Acts, chapter 15. So the first controversy of the early church was whether or not Gentile Christians had to keep the law of Moses. The law of Moses is not the 10 Commandments. The law of Moses are thousands of regulations for daily Jewish life, and a lot of them have to do with rules of ritual purity, what you could touch, where you could go, what you could eat, how you were to wash yourself, how you were to dress. There were thousands of rules like this, even before eventually they were written down. Now they exist in writing for the Jews. And the Jews keep adding to those rules of ritual purity. That's what they call the law of Moses. That's what the Pharisees were often criticizing Jesus for violating. He touched dead bodies. He he allowed the disciples to eat without a ritual washing, things like this. So the question was, when Gentiles began to join the church, the Jewish Christians were still keeping those rules. They didn't completely abandon them. They were still living as Jews. They didn't eat pork. They didn't go into pagan temples. They didn't share meals with pagans, this kind of a thing. So when the Gentiles joined the church, the question arose, do they have to keep these rules? Do they have to be circumcised? That's one of the rules. It's not in the Ten Commandments. Circumcision is not within the Ten Commandments. It's one of the rules that's in the Bible. Other rules at the time of Christ and the apostles, had not been written down. But even circumcision is very important for the Jews. But it's not in the Ten Commandments. It's part of what they call the law of Moses. So the question was, do the Gentiles have to be circumcised? Do they have to follow all these laws? Do they have to keep the Sabbath regulations and all these other things? How could they decide this? Well, the apostles gathered together in the city of Jerusalem for a meeting, a council, and it is called the Council of Jerusalem. We don't know exactly when this was held, maybe around the year 49 or 50. But this is how they resolved the question. Now, was Peter there? Yes, Peter was there. Did he contribute to the discussion? Yes, he did. And was James there? Yes, James was the head of the Church of Jerusalem. And he also was running the meeting, not Peter. Paul was there. Other apostles were there. And Paul presented his case for why Gentiles should not have to keep the law of Moses. And so in the end, the council agreed with Paul, even though James initially thought that they should keep the law of Moses. Why would James, Peter did not, but Peter would have, but he had a special dream, and he had this encounter with Cornelius, a Gentile, who received the Holy Spirit before he was even baptized. And Peter came to understand that the Gentiles did not have to keep the law of Moses. And he shared this at the council with the others, what he had come to understand. But the important thing for our purposes is that Peter was alive. And he wasn't even running the meeting, let alone people turning to him and saying, Peter, you're the Pope. Why don't you tell us what to do? So the church held a council. The apostles held a council to decide whether or not the Gentile Christians had to keep the law of Moses. Notice that that council, by the way, has nothing to do with Jewish Christians and their way of life. It was presumed that Jewish Christians would continue to keep the law. And for a while they did, but eventually they dropped the law of Moses, and no Christians kept the law. And that was seen as a denial of Christ to continue to keep the law. So the point is that the Council of Jerusalem is very important because it is the model by which the church decided controversies. They didn't turn to one person, one bishop, to make the decision for them. Whenever there was a disagreement or a controversy, all of the bishops met together in a council. And this is why the church continues today to hold councils. And frankly, all Christian churches hold councils. Baptists have councils, the Presbyterians have councils, Lutherans and Methodists, all kinds of people hold councils. The Orthodox hold councils. There are councils of bishops. For us, there are also councils in which we involve priests and laity. This is how we decide things, not with one person dictating what's going to happen for the entire church. Even the Catholic Church holds councils. However, the Pope can overrule the decision of the council. And this is something which was never happening in the early church. People had to come to an agreement, and the whole group decided together. That's what they followed. So this is how the early church functioned. Now, how do we know that Roman primacy is based on the fact that Rome was the capital of the empire and not some special prerogative, special blessing, special authority given to Peter and to the bishops of Rome? I don't like to say his successors, because Peter was never the bishop of Rome, or that there was some sort of special blessing given to these bishops. Instead, it was because of the place of the city of Rome in terms of its importance in the empire. How do we know this? Because At the Second Ecumenical Council that was held in 381 in the city of Constantinople, Constantinople was recently made into the imperial capital, the eastern capital. And there at Constantinople, they created what is called today the Pentarchy. At that ecumenical council, they said that Constantinople will be second in place after Rome because it is the imperial capital, because it's second after old Rome, the ancient Rome, the pagan Rome. It's going to be placed second in the ranks of honor. And this shows us there's absolutely no connection with Peter and Constantinople. So this shows us that the Church of Rome was first because it was the capital, because as soon as the brand new city was built, that is Constantinople, and it became the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, it's given this kind of authority or this kind of standing or the status above older established cities like Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem. And that's because of its political importance in the empire. So anyhow, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm not sure if we have, I see a pink, I don't know, I'm not sure if we have another caller for this. Do we have another caller? I guess not.
Yeah,
okay.
Dr. Jeannie, can you hear me?
Excellent. Hi. Yes, I can hear you. Welcome to Search the Scriptures. What's your name and where are you from?
Thank you. My name's Jared. I'm calling from Tennessee, and I had a question concerning the job description of the Roman pontiff versus the job description of the patriarchs in the Orthodox Church. If you can describe succinctly what the differences are.
The job description, huh? Well, there isn't a job description. We have that idea modernly about a job having a description. You're talking about what responsibilities they have, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the responsibilities of we could say the classic ancient patriarchates. We have Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. They are responsible for the cities or for the bishops within their geographical area. And originally, it was just that particular geographical area, that city, that they were responsible for. But they also serve as kind of heads of, let's take something like, I'm trying to think of something like Constantinople, of course. Constantinople is responsible for the churches within its own city, but also because of canonical prerogative, it was given responsibility for what they call barbarian lands. That meant areas that fell outside of the ecumeny, outside of the borders of the Roman Empire. So first and foremost, all of those bishops, all of those men were just bishops of their city. Now under them, because if it was a big city, there could be multiple bishops. And for example, Bishop Basil, Archbishop of Caesarea, when St. Basil was Archbishop of Caesarea, that's one city. But it had a lot of churches, and it served a certain geographical area. He had 50 bishops under him. So, but this does not mean that he would make all the decisions. When there was a controversy or question, they would get together as a council. Is that what you're asking me about? How they function?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
So there was, you were first of all responsible for the churches within your own city as a bishop. But sometimes their geographical area extended outside because there were rural areas outside of those. But they didn't assert themselves in a way that, for example, we have in America, we have big jurisdictions. We have big areas of geographical. I'm in the Greek Archdiocese. Our metropolitan is in San Francisco, and he's the only bishop over us. And it's a very big geographical area. Washington State, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Alaska, Nevada, Arizona. That's a big geographical area, but he's the only bishop. He has an assistant bishop, but he's the only bishop. But if there were Usually there, because these were traditional Orthodox lands, there were other bishops who operated independently over their own city and their own geographic region. What we have in America is a very unusual situation. Is that what you're asking me to talk about?
Yes, ma'am. I was just kind of curious because, sometimes I get into conversations with Roman Catholics, and, I know that our view of the patriarchs and their responsibilities is different, but sometimes I have trouble explaining what the differences are.
Well, we don't have the kind of elaborate structure of the church that the Roman Catholics have, with tremendous number of employees and departments and things like this. The Bishop of Rome is in charge of the entire church and everything that happens, and he can overrule anything. We just don't have that level of authority vested in one person, and this was something that grew very gradually. And even though they see somebody like the ecumenical patriarch, he seems to be presiding over liturgy, let's say, like the Pope might. He simply doesn't have that kind of authority. The ecumenical patriarch cannot decide things for the entire church or for all of the bishops who are, let's say, under his part of his responsibility. So the reason why we in America, the Greek Americans, are under the ecumenical patriarch is because we are part of barbarian lands. That is anything outside of the empire. So that would be America, Canada, Australia, other places. Greece was not part of that. So he's not responsible for the Church of Greece. The Church of Greece operates independently of the ecumenical patriarch. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the Archbishop of Constantinople, before they were called patriarchs, was not responsible for the Church of Jerusalem or all the churches under the Bishop of Jerusalem or the churches of Africa. So they have more of a sense of a geographical responsibility, whereas for the Catholics, the Pope is in charge of all of the churches anywhere in the world. And by the way, he can appoint, he does appoint every single bishop of every single city in the Roman Catholic Church around the world. That's absolutely impossible for us to imagine. Our patriarchs don't appoint the bishops of all of the churches in everywhere. So they, even when there's let's say an open see, they don't decide by themselves. There are a couple of candidates that are proposed, and then they decide together. I think the best way to talk about how, or to illustrate how the patriarchates function, the different churches, the autonomous churches of the Orthodox Church function, is what happened during COVID, when there was a controversy about the multiple spoons. You know about this, right? Are you aware of this?
I'm not familiar with it.
All right. So what happened was, during COVID, there were some bishops who wanted priests to use multiple spoons for communion. And this became kind of a controversy in the church. So the way Rome would have handled it is that they would have a statement by the Pope or somebody acting under his authority, one of their different ministries or departments, with the Pope's approval, because nothing is published without his approval. He would make a decision for the whole church, and everybody would take their marching orders, and that would be the decision. But here's how we handled it. This became a controversy. So the ecumenical patriarch contacted all of the heads of all of the autocephalous, that is independent Orthodox churches, and he asked them what were they doing about this, what was their opinion about this, and then together they drafted a document that was agreed upon by all of them, and then they sent that out to the whole church. And their decision was that multiple spoons should not be used, but if a bishop felt that that was something that was appropriate, he was free to do that. So notice that they came up with a joint position on it, but still recognized the right of a bishop to make his own decision based upon his circumstances. Do you see my point? That's a classic difference. Go ahead.
So it seems like what you're saying is if, God forbid we had a bad patriarch, it wouldn't be as much of an issue as it would be in the Roman Catholic world.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Our church does not depend upon the direction of our church does not depend upon who the patriarch is, who the Archbishop of Greece is, whatever. We've had good ones, we've had bad ones, and the church continues because we don't change depending upon the decision of one person. And that's the great weakness, unfortunately, for Catholics. They see the papacy as their strength because they have been told that Rome is stability. If you count on Rome, you can count on Rome to always say the truth, to be right, that God has given this special insight, special charism to the Bishop of Rome. Rome cannot err. They actually are told that the Bishop of Rome cannot make a mistake. Now, some of them will recognize that bishops of Rome have made mistakes, even have indulged in heresy, even have taught heresy. But they believe, even those Catholics believe that even if a pope is wrong, that the next pope will correct it, or that later in the life of the church it will be corrected. So they have this confidence based on a person. We, however, have our confidence that we will correctly preserve the Orthodox faith because the entire church preserves it. So, for example, if the bishop or the Archbishop of Constantinople, in other words, the ecumenical patriarch, does something that's really wrong, he will be censured by other bishops. They will ignore that. They might even depose him. So we actually saw that a few years ago. You don't really hear about these things. And by the way, I'm glad you're asking the question, because sometimes Orthodox get very nervous. They say, well, there's this and this is going on. And why isn't anybody doing anything about it? Well, you can be assured that when a bishop steps out of line and teaches something that's contrary to the Orthodox tradition, other bishops do respond. They do react. But usually it's behind the scenes at their meetings. And this is how the Orthodox handle it. They'll handle it very quietly, and they'll tell him, you were wrong to do that, you were wrong to say that. But they don't publicize it. They don't embarrass him by letting the whole world know that they have censured him. But I will give you an example of something that did happen. A few years ago, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, the Patriarch of Jerusalem was establishing churches outside of his area. Now, the area of Jerusalem is the Holy Land. He's responsible, and there's lots of churches and monasteries. He's responsible for those. He cannot plant a church, establish a parish, and have a parish in California responsible or answerable to the Church of Jerusalem. But that actually happened. It happened here in America, and it happened in Australia. And there was one such church not far from us here in San Diego that said that they came under the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And that's kind of impossible because he doesn't have that canonical authority. Churches that are established in the New World are supposed to come under the ecumenical patriarch. So the other bishops, Orthodox bishops, said you can't do that to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and you have to withdraw. You cannot have cannot have churches in the New World that come under you. This was something new. In other words, it wasn't started by immigrants who came and then they were like under Antioch or Russia or something like this. And he refused to listen to them, so that he was deposed. And other things that happened. So our bishops have the ability to depose a bishop who's out of line, but nobody can remove the Pope. Nobody can censure the Pope. And that's why the papacy is very dangerous. And that's how the Catholic Church has continued to develop and change dramatically over the centuries, because there was no checks and balances against the authority of the papacy. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for calling in, and we're basically out of time now, but I'll say a few more things. But thank you very much for calling in.
Thank you.
Blessed a resurrection. Okay, so let me just, as we close down, because we were a little bit late starting, I'll just take a few more minutes and sort of talk to you about how this papal supremacy developed very slowly in the Roman Church. We'll just start with some of the early things. Pope Damasus, now listen to this. This is when the church, all of the bishops of the church, this is an ecumenical council, the Second Ecumenical Council, when they got together and said that the Council of Constantinople, or rather the See of Constantinople, will be second after Rome, because it is New Rome, the Bishop of Rome, that it was Pope Damasus at the time, recognized that this meant that Rome had its primacy of honor because of its role as the capital. And he didn't like that. He wanted to assert that he had a special prerogative from God, had nothing to do with the political situation, nothing to do with the fact that Rome was the capital of the empire. And so Pope Damasus was the first person to promote this idea that the Roman Church, and he was the Pope from 366 to 84, the Roman Church had primacy of honor because the Bishop of Rome was the successor of Peter. So this happened almost in the year 400. He was the first one to assert that theory, that he has primacy of honor because he is the successor of St. Peter. And he is the first person to call Rome the Apostolic See. And he was the first person, this is Pope Damasus, who was Pope of Rome from 366 to 384, the first person to call his fellow bishops sons rather than brothers. That's very significant because he's saying, I'm your papa. That's what Pope means. Pope, papa means daddy. I am above you. I have authority over you. This is very significant because in the Orthodox Church, the bishops are all equal. They're all brothers. Now, Pope Damasus's successor, Pope Siricius, who was in 384 to 399, was the first Bishop of Rome ever to issue a papal decretal. That is an executive order, a decree. A decretal is something that was done by an emperor. That's basically an executive, as I said, executive order, a decree, an order that everybody has to follow. That is not something that's ever done in the Orthodox Church. We can have our local bishop, he can issue an order to the priests in his diocese. This is what I want you to do. You have to use this translation, or you can't allow this any longer, or you must allow this. He could do that. But bishops can't give other bishops orders in the Orthodox Church. But Pope Damasus' successor, Pope Siricius, issued the first papal decretal. And by the 6th century, papal decretals were accepted as authority. So, and of course, in the East, this never happened. The word pope comes from papa, and it was Pope Liberius who first used that, and this was in the year 366, and that means daddy. Here again, it's a kind of asserting a kind of supremacy. But notice that this happened. So first they take the title pope. And by the way, the Bishop of Alexandria, Archbishop of Alexandria, Patriarch of Alexandria, is also called the Pope. The Pope of Alexandria, he also has that title. You should know that. There are two of them. There's one that the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox recognize, and then there's one that the Coptics recognize and that they call the Pope in Alexandria. So first you have Pope Liberius in 366 calling himself Pope, Papa, which means daddy. Then you have Damasus, who says that Peter, that the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, has special authority because he is a successor of Saint Peter, and he calls Pope Damasus, says that Rome is the Apostolic See, as if it's the only one. And he calls his fellow bishops sons, not brothers. And then after him, Pope Siricius issues the first papal decretal. And then in the next century, we have in 495, Pope Gelasius, who is the first to be addressed as the Vicar of Christ. That's a very important title that is still used. So gradually, every pope, just about every pope, added to his claims of authority until we get to somebody like Gregory VII in the late, around the year 1100, who said that the Pope can judge everyone and he can be judged by no one. Tremendous claims of papal power. And so these things were already put in place long before the Great Schism. Well, anyhow, we're going to have to continue. We didn't really get to the keys. I thought we were going to get to the keys tonight, but a combination of technical difficulties, my voice giving out, and our calls made this impossible for us to finish our passage. But we will continue with this next week, okay? So I hope you will join me at that time. I hope my voice is better. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.